Hey guys, lead, arsenic, white as in white as snow. What do all these things have in common? They're all white. And in medieval Europe, being white was all the rage. It was the height of fashion to have a face so white it looked dead. But why? Well, it comes down to one simple reason: money. Medieval people had figured out that being sick and staying indoors made you pale. And being rich meant you didn't have to work in the fields like a peasant, which made you pale. So the logic went, the whiter your face, the richer you are, and people went to extreme lengths to achieve this ghastly complexion. Women would take white lead and vinegar and mix it into a paste and then rub it into their faces. Lead, yes, that heavy metal that can cause organ failure and death. But hey, if it makes you look rich, who cares, right? Now, it didn't take much lead to turn your skin an unhealthy shade of green. So some women would mix in a little arsenic, which is deadly at even tiny doses. It turns out that white as marble was also white as bone. If your skin still looked kind of alive and healthy, you could try slapping on some chalk or a bleach paste. And if that didn't work, well, there was always mercury, which people would scrub their faces with to get that "I might die soon, but I look rich" aesthetic. Basically, anything that would make your skin white and preferably a little rotten was considered fashionable. Of course, all this wasn't just about your face. Medieval women also wore veils, hats, and gloves not to protect themselves from the sun, but to protect their already pale skin from getting even a little bit tanner. Even their undergarments were often white, which is lucky for us because it gave us a wonderful opportunity to make a bunch of jokes about underwear. Who knows? Maybe it's best to go commando. This obsession with whiteness literally drove women to the brink of death. One woman named Lavinia, who we mentioned in a previous video, died after painting her face with white lead for an entire year. Her face turned a horrible shade of green and she had convulsions, which means she probably suffered from lead poisoning. But while her face may have been green, at least she was still white, which in the Middle Ages counted for a lot. Doctors knew that lead was poisonous, but that didn't stop them from prescribing it for a variety of ailments. After all, if a little bit of lead will kill you, why not try a whole lot to cure your boils? Or here, take this lead-laced ointment and rub it into your poor aching bones. And it wasn't just doctors who prescribed lead. You could find it in everything from cosmetics to toys to candy. Children would eat lead-laced sweets and then promptly become lead poisoned. Parents, if you want to keep your kids safe, don't give them sweets, especially if they're white. It wasn't uncommon for people to cover up their lead-induced maladies with even more lead. That's how you got a nice little feedback loop going where lead poisoning damages your skin, and then you use more lead to cover up the damage, which leads to more lead poisoning. So if you were covered head to toe in lead, you would look white as snow. You'd also probably be dead within a few years. But even death couldn't stop the ladies of the Middle Ages from achieving their favorite look. After all, what's a little thing like death when you got a date with the hottest guy in town? And speaking of hot guys in the Middle Ages, women would pluck out their eyebrows and even the hair on their forehead to make their faces look longer and more refined. A high forehead was seen as a sign of intelligence and even sexual desirability. In fact, some women would start removing their body hair as early as age 10. So if you want to attract a hot guy in the Middle Ages, you'd need to start tweezing early and often, and you definitely don't want to skip leg day at the gym. Because in the Middle Ages, having a big butt was all the rage. I mean, come on, just look at those cheeks. Now, if only there was a way to get it perfectly round. Luscious, but without having to sit on a barrel all day. Ah, never mind. It seems that women in the Middle Ages did just that. And to learn how they achieved this modest mound of magnificence, stay tuned. What would you say is the most beautiful body in the world? Is it the body of an Olympian who has spent years honing her physique to perfection? Or maybe the body of a supermodel who seems to have stepped out of a magazine ad? Or perhaps the body of a pregnant woman glowing with the radiance of life? Well, apparently none of these are the most beautiful bodies in the world because according to the standards of the medieval era, none of these women had bodies worth showing off. In fact, a woman's body in the medieval era wasn't really her own. It was a canvas for society's impossible expectations. Forget the natural variety of human shapes. The ideal medieval woman was supposed to be thin, but not bony, curvy but not vulgar, small-waisted yet not muscular. And heaven forbid she had strong legs or arms, those hinted at labor, which meant peasantry, and we can't have that. So how did they do it? How did they warp themselves into these impossibly perfect shapes without the help of tight corsets or modern plastic surgery? Well, not quite. Tight corsets weren't yet in fashion, but women still wrapped their waists with stiffened garments to give the illusion of a smaller midsection. They also used padded brass and undergarments that accentuated the correct areas. And of course there was makeup, lots of makeup. Women used makeup not only to enhance their features, but to completely alter them to fit the ideals of beauty. White lead, a common ingredient in makeup during this time, was toxic and often led to severe health issues and even death. But hey, if you want to look beautiful, you've got to suffer a little, right? This beauty standard wasn't just about clothes. It was about reshaping the body into a near non-existent, barely there silhouette. And if your natural features didn't align, too bad. Your job was to conform, not to be comfortable. And it wasn't just their faces and bodies that women were expected to alter. Their voices were also subject to the whims of society. Women were expected to speak in a high-pitched, refined voice that was pleasing to the ear. Anything else was seen as unladylike and vulgar. Imagine the pressure of having to constantly perform femininity, not just in your appearance, but in your very essence. One false note, and you're deemed unworthy. It's hard to imagine a time when beauty standards were so extreme and unattainable, but it's a reality that many women have faced throughout history. Today we look back and shake our heads in disbelief at the lengths women went to achieve an impossible standard. But it's important to remember that this wasn't just a quaint part of the past. It's a reminder of how far we've come and how much work still needs to be done. And what about those poor souls who didn't have the luxury of choosing when to reveal their pregnant bellies? Women in the medieval era were expected to hide their pregnancies for as long as possible because while childbirth was essential to noble families, flaunting the result of sex was frowned upon. By the way, that's the whole reason why they wore those big, cumbersome dresses. It wasn't just to look pretty. It was to hide the one part of their body that was absolutely forbidden to show off their thighs. I mean, come on, don't these things scream, "Do not touch"? But here's the kicker. Even after all this effort, even after wrapping their waists, flattening their chests and hiding their bellies, women were still expected to appear delicate and refined. If they looked like they were in pain, well, that was just another sign of feminine fragility. It was almost as if society wanted to make the pursuit of beauty as painful as possible. And it wasn't just women who suffered. Men had their own set of impossible standards. Male beauty standards in the medieval era valued traits such as masculinity, strength, and prowess in battle. This often resulted in men being judged solely on their ability to conform to a narrow definition of what it meant to be a man. They were expected to be stoic, unemotional, and dominant. They needed to have a certain level of physical prowess, and they were penalized for any perceived weakness. Just imagine the pressure of having to live up to these standards day in and day out. A single slip-up could result in being labeled as less than a man. In the end, these standards were not just about aesthetics. They were about power, control, and societal norms. They were a way to keep people in line, to maintain the social order, and to ensure that everyone knew their place. But thankfully, today we understand that true beauty comes in all shapes, sizes, and forms. We celebrate diversity and individuality, and we strive to create a world where everyone feels comfortable in their own skin, or do we? When we think of medieval beauty standards, we picture pale skin, dark lips, and flowing medieval gowns. But what about medieval hairstyles? Well, it's complicated. You see, medieval beauty had a complicated relationship with hair. On one hand, long, flowing hair was seen as the ultimate symbol of femininity and purity, especially if it was golden blonde. Queen Isabella of Bavaria, wife of King Edward I of England, set the trend for the era with her long, flowing golden tresses. In art and literature, the most beautiful women were always depicted with long, luscious locks. Rapunzel would have fit right in during the Middle Ages. On the other hand, too much hair in the wrong places was sinful, grotesque, and worthy of public shame. In fact, the more natural the hair, the worse it was considered. That meant unfortunate women who suffered from what we today call male pattern baldness were thought to be especially sinful. And while a woman's long hair was seen as a virtue, unwanted hair in other places was not. According to the standards of female beauty in the Middle Ages, a woman should have just enough hair, but only in the right places. During the Middle Ages, women often bleached their hair with lye or exposed it to harsh sunlight and even urine to lighten it to an acceptable shade. If nature didn't bless you with golden tresses, medieval beauty recipes promised magical transformations, most of which involved burning your scalp or ruining your follicles forever. If you wanted to cover up those pesky gray hairs, you might rub your head with vinegar and a little burnt cork to give it a golden glow. Or perhaps try out this simple recipe to remove those ugly gray hairs. Take 12 fresh figs, chop them up finely, and put them in a red-hot frying pan. After which, having taken some fine wool, dip it in the fig and rub your head with it. Or maybe this one, boil some fennel and vinegar and rub your head with the hot water. Keep it on as long as you can, then wash your hair with cold water. Your hair will soon turn gold. All three are guaranteed to turn your hair gold, or at least stain it so that it looks that way. But they also all involve repeatedly scorching your scalp. So take that risk if you want. But say you wanted to remove facial hair, no problem. Medieval women plucked their eyebrows and eyelashes. Plucking was considered the safest and most effective method of removing unwanted hair. It allowed women to maintain the illusion of youthful innocence by framing their eyes with nothing but skin. To prevent hair regrowth, women applied a variety of concoctions to their faces after plucking, such as dousing their faces with boiling hot water or rubbing them with crushed dried parsnip leaves. For a more permanent hair removal solution, women used more drastic measures, rubbing their faces with walnut oil and then letting the oil sit for several hours before scrubbing it off. The oil's high concentration of hydrocyanic acid worked to stop hair growth. In fact, there were many products and treatments available to medieval women to help them keep their faces hair-free, including depilatory creams, devices that used hot sugar to rip hair out by its roots, and even pumice stones to remove any peach fuzz that dared to appear on their skin. Sounds terrifying. And what about body hair? Well, women who showed any body hair, whether it was under their arms or down below, were judged harshly and accused of being hairy wild women. Medieval women removed any unwanted body hair by shaving it off with razors or by using a form of waxing. So there you have it, the bizarre beauty standards of the Middle Ages. You had to have just enough hair, but only in the right places. If you survived the weird beauty treatments, that is, what do you think of medieval beauty standards? Would you ever try any of these treatments yourself? Let us know in the comments and stay tuned for more fun history videos. Hello everyone. Today we'll be looking at beauty standards in medieval Europe. So, if you thought beauty was about self-expression, medieval Europe would like a word. Religion dominated every inch of life, and that included how women looked. Vanity was a sin, but being ugly was no better. It was seen as a sign of moral or spiritual failing. Basically, you were damned if you did and damned if you didn't. The church encouraged women to dress modestly, cover their bodies, and avoid adornments. But that didn't stop nobles from sneaking in forbidden luxuries. Bejeweled girdles, velvet gowns, and forbidden perfumes were quietly passed through high-ranking hands. The clergy condemned it from the pulpit. But let's not pretend bishops didn't wear gold-threaded robes themselves. Cosmetics were especially controversial. Using makeup was condemned as deceitful, an affront to God's natural design, but guess who used it anyway? Everyone who could afford to. Royal women painted their faces white, rouged their cheeks, and darkened their lips in private while publicly denying they ever touched such unholy tools. The message was clear: look beautiful, but pretend it's all natural. If your face was flushed, you were blushing with innocence. If your lips were red, it was the cold wind, not berry dye. Women had to walk a tightrope of holiness and allure, perfection and piety. Even saints weren't spared. Many female saints were praised for their beauty, not their brains. Their holiness was often described through their physical radiance, as if the only way to prove divine favor was to be hot. Now, let's look at some of the beauty secrets of the time. White was the color of beauty. No, not like the Kardashians, the Egyptians. White skin was a sign of wealth and power. Only the elite could afford to cover up from the sun. And those commoners who worked outside often had to resort to using unrefined ingredients like flour and water to cover up blemishes. White lead was the ultimate beauty secret, even though it was, poisonous. Small price to pay for looking fabulous. Red lips were also a must. And the way to get that perfect pout was to use scented oils. Rose-scented oil was the most popular choice, but other flowers like lavender, rosemary, and chamomile were also used. Sometimes these oils would contain small amounts of beeswax or animal fat to help them stay on longer. Beeswax, because why not? Animal fat EU. Another beauty secret was using scented waters. These were basically like perfumes, but less concentrated. They were made by mixing flowers, herbs, or spices with water and then boiling them. The mixture would then be strained and bottled up. The most popular scented water was rose water, which was used as a toner and a perfume. Now let's talk about hair. The ideal medieval hairstyle was the braid. It was simple, it was classic, and it was very versatile. You could wear it long and flowing, or you could pull it back tight to keep it out of your face. The length of your braid also had a meaning. A longer braid meant that you were young and unmarried, while a shorter braid meant that you were married. The style also depended on your status. Wealthy women could afford to have their hair braided by servants, while poorer women had to do their own hair. And let's face it, those elaborate braids were a pain in the butt to do. Another beauty trend was using herbal hair dyes. The most popular color was, of course, blonde, which was achieved by using a mixture of herbs like chamomile and lavender. Brunettes used a mixture of herbs like sage and walnut to keep their hair color looking rich and shiny. Highlights were also popular, and these were achieved by using a mixture of lemon juice and honey. So there you have it, a glimpse into the strange and sometimes gross world of medieval beauty standards. From white lead to beeswax, these beauty secrets were definitely unique to their time. But one thing's for sure, they wouldn't work today. When people think medieval fashion, they often imagine flowing gowns and majestic cloaks. But wearing these clothes wasn't exactly comfortable. Especially for women, fashion wasn't about practicality. It was about control, class, and pain disguised as beauty. Let's talk about those long gowns. They weren't just for looking fancy. They were supposed to show that you didn't need to do anything. Sleeves were sometimes so long they dragged on the floor, which made everyday tasks like sitting down or bending to pick something up nearly impossible. If your sleeves dipped in your soup, congratulations, you were high class. You had so much money you could afford to waste it on new clothes because your status was so high. Other women would see you and think, wow, I wish I could just sit around all day and dip my fingers in soup without having to worry about ruining my dress. While simultaneously thinking, why does her skirt keep falling into her wine glass? It's like she can't even walk in those things. If you were lower status, your gown might have been shorter, but it was still tight. Bodices made breathing difficult. Even without corsets in the modern sense, medieval dresses were laced tightly to flatten the chest and cinch the waist. To make sure the dress kept its shape, women sometimes wore stiffened undergarments, which could chafe, bruise, or restrict movement. Imagine trying to breathe while someone was squeezing your ribs. Shoes were also not designed for walking. Pointed shoes became a trend among nobles. The longer the toe, the wealthier you were. Because the shoes were so long, they had to be tied to the knees with chains to walk. Can you imagine trying to navigate a crowded room party with those things on? These weren't designed to walk in but to exist in like wearable status symbols, but the worst offenders were the hats. Hennins, those tall, cone-like hats, could be several feet high, wrapped in delicate veils. Trying to fit one of those babies on your head was an ordeal in itself. And once it was on, the hat was awkward, uncomfortable, and sat precariously on top of your head. Anyone who has ever worn a party hat for an extended period of time knows how annoying it is to have something sitting on top of your head. Now imagine that hat is at least 3 feet tall and weighs several pounds. Just the wind could knock them over. And if that happened, every head in the vicinity would turn to see who was the clumsy fool that knocked the expensive hat off. not to mention how difficult it must have been for women to go through doorways. You'd think that when a woman walked into a room, everyone would be in awe of her finery. But really, they'd probably be thinking, please hurry up and get out of our doorway so we can go about our business. But perhaps even more importantly, clothing was heavy. Medieval garments were thick and layered. In summer, women might wear linen undergarments, a cotton or linen kirtle, a heavier wool or silk overdress and an outer cloak, plus hose, shoes, and a hat. That's a lot of fabric, and it would get pretty hot under all those layers. Then there were the accessories. Women often wore jewelry, including elaborate headpieces. This made dressing up a real pain. But refusing to follow the trends could mean losing social standing. In courtly love poetry, the lady is often described as being too good and pure to do her own laces or other tasks. This image of the dainty lady was partly why medieval clothing became so elaborate. But it also helped that women had servants to dress them. When the queen dressed, there would be ladies-in-waiting helping to pull on her gown and arrange her veil. The queen wouldn't have to do any of it herself. For commoners, though, clothing was a necessary evil. It was freezing cold in the winter, so you had to wear heavy, thick clothes, but no one was coming to help you put them on. You'd have to dress yourself and maybe help your husband take his hose off after a long day of work. There was no such thing as sweatpants back then. No loose, comfy clothes. Everyone was stuck in uncomfortable, restrictive clothing, whether they liked it or not. Clothing was expensive back then, and not just for the wealthy, but for everyone. So when you had a garment, you were expected to wear it until it literally fell apart. You patched and darned your clothes, making repairs so they'd last as long as possible. Sometimes you get so used to the holes in your clothes that you wear them just the way they were. It was a sign of poverty, really, if you couldn't afford new clothes. And while the wealthy could afford to look their best, they were just as frustrated by the restrictions of fashion as anyone else. Beauty in medieval fashion was not about personal taste. It was about submission, wearing what you were told, no matter how inconvenient, as a walking display of obedience and rank. Thanks for watching. Those luscious locks you've been admiring in all those old paintings, they weren't just a pretty face. They were a powerful symbol of female beauty in medieval times. And what was beautiful was not necessarily pretty. Just ask any woman who got caught up in the beauty standards of the era. In the Middle Ages, a woman's appearance wasn't just her problem. It was her family's business. Beauty wasn't personal. It was political, and a woman's looks could make or break her family. From the time they were little girls, noble girls were raised to be marriageable. And their looks were carefully groomed to meet the standards of the day. So how did medieval women become so beautiful? Let's take a journey back in time and find out. It all started at birth. The moment a baby girl was born, her future was uncertain. Her looks would determine whether she would marry well, whether she would bring honor to her family. That's because in medieval times, a beautiful daughter was currency. She could attract a rich husband or secure a valuable alliance. And if she was unattractive, well, she might be shunned by society. So from the time they were tiny tots, noble girls were put through a beauty regimen. First up, their skin had to be kept as white as possible. That meant no sunbathing, no fresh air, no exercise. The paler the better. Why? Because the sun was believed to cause freckles, wrinkles, and other blemishes. And that was just unacceptable. To keep their skin looking flawless, medieval girls used creams and lotions made with ingredients like lead and mercury. Talk about toxic beauty standards. But it wasn't just their faces that needed attention. Their hair had to be long and flowing, their bodies perfectly proportioned. Every morning, they would wake up before dawn and immediately begin their beauty routine. They would wash their face and neck with cold water, then apply a whitening cream. Next, they would don a corset to mold their waist to the perfect shape. And let's not forget the elaborate hairstyles. They were a must-have accessory for any noble woman. Their hair was washed with a special shampoo made with herbs and flowers, then combed and braided for hours on end. And don't think that the men were exempt from all this. They, too, had their beauty standards. For them, it was all about looking strong and virile. That meant lots of expensive perfumes and powders to cover up any, shall we say, unpleasant odors. But while men were expected to smell nice, women were judged on their voices. You see, in medieval times, a woman's voice was considered a sign of her beauty, and that meant that they had to be careful about how they sounded. A woman with a low, throaty voice was seen as sultry and desirable, while a woman with a high, nasal voice was considered unattractive. That's why many women tried to alter their voices, often by singing or chanting. They believed that this would help them sound more beautiful. And let's not forget the ultimate test of beauty, a woman's hands. In medieval times, a woman's hands were on display for all to see. They were the perfect indicator of her status. If her hands were soft and well manicured, it meant that she was wealthy and had plenty of time on her hands. But if her hands were rough and red, it meant that she was poor and worked hard as a peasant. That's why every noblewoman wore gloves to cover up her hands and maintain her beauty. But no matter how much effort they put into their looks, there was no guarantee that it would pay off. Marrying a rich and powerful man was still a crapshoot. A woman could do everything right, from maintaining her youthful appearance to keeping her voice in check, and still end up with no one. That's because in medieval times, beauty wasn't just about looks. It was also about luck. In the end, it was a woman's destiny, not her beauty, that determined her fate. Now it's time to hear from you. What do you think of the beauty standards in medieval times? Were they fair? Were they achievable? Share your thoughts below. You might think those old-timey beauty standards were just silly and a little bit gross, like using lead makeup or plucking your eyebrows into an arch. But in the end, medieval beauty standards weren't just uncomfortable, they were cruel. They punished women for aging, for working, for being poor, for being too visible or too plain, too attractive or not attractive enough. It was a game rigged from the start, and the prize was often misery. Aging, in particular, was treated like a disease. Wrinkles were shameful. Gray hair had to be hidden, if not with dye, then with head coverings. Older women were often viewed as suspicious, irrelevant, or even dangerous. It is no coincidence that many accused witches were older women whose looks no longer fit society's beauty ideals. Women were expected to look young, and those standards were especially strict for the most privileged women, those with wealth, titles, and servants. Rulers like Elizabeth I of England, Mary, Queen of Scots, and Catherine de' Medici spent tons of money on elaborate gowns and cosmetics to make themselves look as youthful as possible. And even the most beautiful women had to contend with whispers about their looks. Take Isabella of Castile, who married Ferdinand to unite Spain under their rule. Artists have praised her beauty, but also criticized her for not measuring up to her idealized image. She was called the most beautiful woman in the world, yet also the most ugly. Beauty ideals can do that. Erase a person until all you have is a canvas to project your fantasies onto. And for women lower down the ladder, beauty standards were even more unreachable. They didn't have access to lid makeup, silk gowns, or golden hair treatments. But the ideals still hovered over them like a cruel joke. Standards set by nobles, reinforced by the church, and whispered about in every market and chapel. The pressure to conform was constant, showing up in the most unexpected places. Take marriage, for example. For many women, it was a way to economic security and social mobility. But to get hitched, you had to look the part. Marrying a wealthy widower could be a good deal for a young woman, except you were expected to mourn his children as if they were your own. Marrying a man from a lower social class meant you were trading up, but you'd have to put up with gossip about why he chose you. Choosing to stay single meant you were probably too ugly or too poor to find a husband. And if you did find a way to say yes to yourself, you'd still have to fight against stereotypes that portrayed single women as bitter, angry, or in league with the devil. Just ask the painter Artemisia Gentileschi. Her father was tried for raping her, and she was grilled for 5 months about her behavior, implying that no respectable woman would go out alone at night, certainly not to meet her lovers. After all, what respectable woman would want to be touched by a man other than her husband? But amidst all this, there were glimmers of resistance. Some women wore makeup in secret, like the 15th century Italian noblewoman Isabella Andreini, who wrote about using white lead to cover up her freckles. Others mocked the fashion of the upper class. Peasants sometimes poked fun at the elite for their fancy clothes and elaborate hairstyles. As one English proverb put it, the more fine a woman is, the more sorrow she makes. Still others leaned into natural remedies, not to become someone else, but to soothe their own skin or scent their hair with herbs. And some refused to follow the trends, like the Scottish Queen Mary, Queen of Scots, who preferred simple, comfortable clothing, even if it meant ignoring royal fashions. The fact that these women continued to live, love, raise children, and manage households in the face of such impossible demands is a quiet kind of rebellion. It's easy to dismiss their struggles as outdated, but let's be honest, versions of these pressures still exist today. So, as you drift to sleep, think of those women under heavy gowns, plucking their foreheads by candlelight, whispering prayers while hiding a berry-stained lip. They weren't just victims of a cruel system, they were survivors of it. And in every forgotten tale and dusty portrait, there's a silent defiance beneath the powdered skin and plucked brows. Medieval beauty standards weren't just about perfection, they were about enduring the impossible. Good night.